Hello and welcome to Classics Confidential. Today I'm talking with Associate Professor Brooke Holmes from Princeton University. Brooke, you've got an exciting new project about the concept of sympathy. So tell us, what did sympathy mean in antiquity?
Well, it means not what you would think, to put it simply. So when we think of sympathy, we think of, at least in the U.S., something a sympathy card, sympathy for the devil, sympathies for the Communist Party, these sorts of things. And in antiquity, the word sympatheia can sometimes mean fellow feeling. It can sometimes be an interpersonal feeling. But mostly it has to do with the kinds of relationships between different kinds of natures, both human and non-human. Or so you can have sympathies and antipathies between different kinds of plants and animals. So it has a kind of natural history usage. Sympathy can also sometimes have a larger sense of cosmic sympathy. So it's with the Stoics, you get this notion that everything in the universe is sympathetically connected because there's this breath that pervades the entire universe, this pneuma. And so that can account for things like astrology, so sympathy between stars and people and those sorts of things. You can have sympathy between body and mind, so it can be a microcosmic sympathy within a person, within a single nature. Medicine, you have the notion of sympathetic affections, for example. So it has a very different meaning, and at some level, all of those notions of sympathy have a unity to them in that they seem to talk about, well, literally just co-suffering. But at the same time, what's so interesting about sympathy is that it shows up in all of these different domains, not one of which seems to have a monopoly on, okay, sympathy just means this, and somehow that influenced what all of the other domains thought about sympathy. It's organically rooted in all of these different domains that study nature, as it were.
So a much richer concept in a lot of ways than the modern idea.
Yeah, I mean, I would say what's interesting about modern sympathy is that in some sense it's moving back into thinking about sympathy in physical terms, and so far as people are interested in mirror neurons and things like that. And that seems like a pull back from this concept, which is, you know, about emotion as a sort of non-technical thing. And as it moves back towards more scientific models, it's getting closer to ancient notions of sympathy.
Well, that's really exciting,
yeah.
Isn't it? So somehow it's actually going back towards the ancient...
The materialist notion of sympathy, as it were. Yeah.
And do you think there's connections between that and, say, modern ecology and the movement to protect our environment, or that there's perhaps interesting connections there that could be explored further?
I think that one thing that's really interesting to me about sympathy is that the hypothesis that I have now, the working hypothesis, is that in antiquity you have a notion of the polis as a community of humans, and in early Greek poetry, and I mean, indeed throughout antiquity, the idea that gods are like humans and interact with us like social agents, and so the cosmos might be a larger community but still in the model of a polis. Whereas with sympathy, I think you're starting to look at ways of thinking about a community that's cross-species, that's between human and non-humans, where non-humans aren't taken into this community because they act like humans, but rather they're recognized, they have particular natures. And so affect, or pathos, you know, is the bond between, you know, a fig and a you know, vine tree or something like that, but it's not anthropomorphized in the sense of, say, social reciprocity. And so I think you find sympathy as part of, I think, a larger attempt to think about the cosmos beyond the notion of just the human. It's not to say that anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism aren't still part of this model, and indeed one of the concerns of my research is, how does anthropocentrism persist, where this idea that the universe is for the sake of humans, that humans are at the center of the universe, how does that sort of reassert the dominance of the human within this much more, this notion of distributed intelligences within a web? But I do think that there are amazing resonances with what's the interest now in notions of interconnectedness, webs, networks, and certainly the question that a lot of both scientists and humanists are asking now about okay, so we're not just interested in subjects, we're interested in so-called objects or non-human objects, but in what ways can we account for our relationship to them, their relationships with each other, in ways that aren't just reduced to traditional notions of the subject. So thinking the non-human, thinking distributed intelligences, these ideas, I think the ancient material is also trying to work through that in its own way, and is really fascinating for that reason.
Wow, what an exciting project.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Very best of luck. But this this new project, is building on an older project which has already become a book. So tell us about that.
About the first
book. Yeah.
Yeah, so the first book, let me back up. I mean, the Sympathy Project, in a way, is interested in how one notion of nature starts to emerge. So the idea of nature as a concept in antiquity, as somehow tied to this notion of nature as a capital N, encompassing all of these interconnected beings, but also the nature of an individual organism, is also sort of important to thinking around sympathy. The first book is interested in the emergence of the idea of the notion of the body and the concept of the physical body. And so in the same way that nature might seem like something that's always there, every culture has a notion of nature. And really what I want to say is, well, not quite. It's not a given. The notion of the body as given is also problematic. And that the way that people, I think, traditionally told the story, to the extent they were interested in the story of the emergence of, say, dualism, is it was always the soul. So everybody has a notion of the body. Bernard Williams says this in Shame and Necessity, that we all have a notion of the body. It's the soul that's an innovation, and once you have that, and this is the Snellian version, once people come up with the idea of an immaterial part of themselves, the body just sort of falls into place as the rest of our materiality.
Yeah, the sort of second tier.
Yeah, what is not soul, what is not spirit.
Yeah, so less important in some
and less important, and again given. And the project it didn't start off this way, I should say, but the claim of the book is that, in fact, the notion of the biological body is not given. It emerges in part through medical writing, I mean, really in a large part through medical interest in interpreting symptoms differently. So symptoms of disease are no longer traced back to daimonic agents, but in fact become expressions of forces and of a space within the self that is the physical body, that is our human physicality. And through interpreting symptoms differently, they start to develop, or almost implicitly work with this notion of the soma as our sense of, I shouldn't say our sense, but as a notion of the biological body that is somehow also not self, inhuman, impersonal in its forces, non-conscious. It's important to their notion of the body that much of it lies below the threshold of consciousness and outside our direct control, so we can only control this through technical means. And so I argue that as this notion of the body emerges, rather than saying it's a given, or rather than saying, oh, what amazing scientists they've come up with, they've discovered the body, they've discovered naturalistic explanation, that once you introduce that concept, the whole notion of the subject changes, the whole notion of ethical responsibility changes, because this part of you is not you.
No,
and so the notion of the soul actually compensates for the radical materialism of Hippocratic models of the body, of physiology, and that an ethics, a philosophical ethics where the care of the self is a way of dealing with this new part of the self that is responsible for suffering, and yet somehow always estranged from you as an agent. So the book is trying to sort of not just give a different genealogy for dualism, but to say once we stop taking for granted this object, we can see how much of what we're doing is responding to its emergence.
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, ancient medicine talks a lot about the female body. In your work, what was your perception of gender, which is indeed the subject of another of your books? So did your work in ancient medicine perhaps naturally lead into a discussion of the concept of gender in antiquity and in modernity?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the, some of the most innovative work the last 20 years in ancient medicine has been on gender and on the sexed body. And of course, the question of the biological body has been central to gender studies as a field since its inception, to the extent that our working notion of gender is the idea that it's the cultural, malleable part of the self as opposed to the biological bedrock of identity. And so when Feroz asked me to do the gender project, I was initially really responding to work that had been done that characterized the notion of gender, the notion of the body, the notion of sex and antiquity in a particular way, Tom Laqueur's work in particular, and wanting to say, well, the picture is actually much more complex. And that a big part of the gender book for me was trying to unthink sex and gender without the categories of nature and culture that have been so instrumental to structuring those ideas in the contemporary way we think about it. And trying to argue that rather than seeing the ancient models as either just like ours, where the body is the ground of sexed identity, or saying, no, they have the exact opposite model, the body doesn't ground gender at all, it's too fluid, which is Laqueur's model, to say, well, you do have this notion of the physical body and nature grounding a notion of sex and gendered identity, but sex and gender both participate in the material body, and materiality cuts across both categories, as it were. I mean, that's not the whole book. That's one chapter of the book, but for me that was the closest link to the work that I was doing before that. There's also material in the history of sexuality. There's a chapter on politics and how ancient figures have really shaped the notion of debates about women in the state, the gendering of politics as feminine or masculine.
Yes, I mean, that immediately puts in my mind, obviously, the presentation of tragic heroines on the dramatic stage of Athens. And did you become sort of involved quite closely with some of the wonderful literary texts from antiquity, and what role did those play in your research?
Well, I love literature. I mean, literature is really, I was trained in comparative literature, so that's sort of my first love, and certainly in the gender book, Antigone played a role in thinking about how the reception of Antigone has really shaped core notions in political theory and thinking about sexual difference and institutions and resistance and those questions. And that's part of a much larger interest I have in tragedy. In the first book as well, in the dissertation, actually, half the dissertation is on tragedy and half of it is on medicine. In the final product, there's a chapter on Euripides. And for me, literature was really, and tragedy in particular, a space that the problems raised by the notion of the body for notions of suffering, responsibility, blame, they were problematized in tragedy in a way through not just saying, okay, now diseases are somehow medical, but in fact playing with different paradigms. What if we imagine harm to come from the gods, if it's daimonic, if it's unplaceable in the terms of its cause, or if there are sort of models that look like nosos, sickness models from contemporary medicine. And so I always find the challenge with literature in the larger history of ideas, or working with literature in conjunction with other genres, is always to respect the specificity of literature as a mode of knowing, I would say. So that it's never just, oh, here's a medical word in this tragedy, so it's influenced by medicine. Well, what do we mean by that?
Yeah.
Literature takes up problems, philosophical problems, timeless problems, ethical problems, and works them through in a way that no other genre can do. And so in the new project, I use literature in the sense of, I'm interested in the pathetic fallacy, and how this idea of somehow affect or emotion as something that crosses the human and the non-human gets expressed in poetry very differently than in, say, natural history, in philosophy, in other genres, as it were. So I want to always see literature as connected to a larger sort of thought world, but never to lose sight of the specificity of the way that it works through problems.
Well, that's wonderful. Very best of luck with your new project, Brooke, and thank you very much for talking to us.
Pleasure.